Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual panel discussion on closing the gap and building resilience, technology-driven rural development. I think you can all agree the digital economy is rapidly evolving, bringing with it previously unthinkable opportunities for innovation and growth. Now, despite the tragic events and uncertainty, the past year in particular has brought to the forefront the opportunity for technology to break down geographical barriers. It's also demonstrated how timely and accurate data can be leveraged to drive community-centered outcomes and address real-life needs. Although notable challenges exist, which our guests today will certainly dive into, including connectivity and infrastructure, resilient and responsive rural communities are the cornerstone to a strong and competitive digital economy for Canada. And this is the thesis for today's discussion. In a moment, Maria Tomovic, the Deputy Executive Director of Open North, will kick off our discussion today with an overview of her organization's work and the impact they're seeing technology have in communities across Canada. Afterwards, she'll hand the reins over to ICTC's own Chief Research Officer, Alexandra Coutin, who will introduce today's esteemed subject matter experts and guide the panel discussion. I encourage everyone to share any questions or comments you have. We'll look to address them during the Q&A period. So please sit back, enjoy what I expect will be a high energy and illuminating discussion on technology-driven rural development. Maria, thank you for joining me on our virtual stage today. I want to thank you and your colleagues at Open North for being such a wonderful partner organization for helping us pull this discussion together. We're looking forward to future opportunities to work together and to continue this discussion afterwards, as we've seen such a positive response to having this talk today. And I look forward to what you're going to share with us shortly. And thus, I'll go ahead and relinquish the virtual stage to you and let you take it away.
Appreciate it, Tyler. Thank you so much, and welcome to all of our participants. Open North is really excited to be able to participate in this virtual panel. Before we start off with the panel discussion, I wanted to briefly introduce Open North, as well as a free program that we offer through the Community Solutions Network. So I'll just share a couple of slides very quickly, and I'll take you through them before we start with our panelists. So a little bit about who is Open North. We are Canada's leading not-for-profit organization, and we specialize in topics like smart cities, data governance, open procurement, digital inclusion, so on and so forth. Our mission is really to drive the effective and responsible use of data and technology. We are an organization that is technology agnostic, so we would never recommend a specific software solution. What we do is try and work with communities across Canada to really define what the needs are and whether data and technology is a solution for the problems. We are the data governance lead for Montreal's winning Smart City Challenge program. So the Smart Cities Challenge was initiated by the Government of Canada in 2018. And through that, there was the development of a program called the Community Solutions Network, of which we are the lead technical partner. And I'll be sharing a couple of slides to describe what that program is and what the free service offerings are as well. But before we delve into that, I'd like to discuss what is an open smart community. Of course, the name of our organization is Open North. And a lot of the times when we think of smart cities, we don't think of the open aspect of things. So in 2018, as the concept of smart cities became more and more popular, we realized that city stakeholders and decision makers were faced with options that were mostly top-down, privatized, and they would put solutions before problems. So what we decided to do was develop a guide called the Open Smart Cities Guide in collaboration with Dr. Tracy Loriot. And we came up with a first definition of what is an open smart city. So the way we define an open smart city is one where residents, civil society, academics, and the private sector all collaborate together with public officials to mobilize data and technologies when warranted, which is very, very critical because we've got 5 principles that we discuss in our Open Smart Cities Guide, and one of which is technology always the best solution. So what we want to do is develop something that's ethical, accountable, and transparent in a way to govern a city that's fair, viable, and livable, and takes into account and balances economic development, social progress, and environmental responsibility. So what we really like to do is take a holistic approach to issues related to smart cities. So I encourage everyone to visit our website. It's opennorth.ca. We've got lots of guides and free material related to these topics. So in terms of our free program, it's called the Community Solutions Network, and that's done in collaboration with the program lead, which is an organization called Evergreen, and with funding provided by Infrastructure Canada. So as I had mentioned before, in 2018, the government issued a Smart Cities Challenge, and the Community Solutions Network program stemmed from this initiative. So it's essentially a learning and capacity development program to enforce the knowledge of municipalities on topics related to data and technology. As part of this program, Open North's role is as lead technical partner. And what we've done through that program is develop a free advisory service. Through this service, we've recruited 10 experts across Canada, experts in smart city topics. You might recognize Jean-Marc Laflamme, who's going to be participating in this panel discussion and who's been really, really great with us when working with rural communities. We've also got Matthew Claudel, who's on the jury for the Smart Cities Challenge. So as you can see, we've got experts that are specialists in a various range of topics, whether it's open procurement, human rights, mobility, GIS, public engagement. We've really tried to collect a group of advisors that are passionate about the concept of open smart cities and are really working to ensure that data and technology respects the right of citizens as well. In terms of the advisory service, so as I mentioned, this is a free program. What we offer are 3 phone calls with an advisor. So the first phone call essentially is what we call the intake call with the community. So we really start quite high level. What are your challenges related to data and technology? And then we try and funnel to work on a very, very specific problem and then connect you to a specialist advisor in that domain area. In addition to the 3 hours of consulting, we also offer a learning management system that's free of charge as well and has about 20 courses on topics related to open smart cities. So if anyone's interested in this program, we'll be sharing the contact information thereafter, and we're taking on new communities every single month. So I really encourage everyone to take advantage of this free program, which runs until March 2022. A little bit about our learning management system. You can access it at lms.opennorth.ca. This is a free platform, and obviously we're Open North, so everything is open. So all you need to do is go to the website and go into the sign up page, and it's free for all municipal staff. A little example of our course catalog. It's an online bilingual course catalog, and we've divided it into multiple domain areas. So, whether you're just learning, we've got 100 level classes or 200 level classes for more advanced topics. But you could see we have what are the fundamentals of open smart cities? What are open standards for data? What is open procurement? We've got artificial intelligence, digital literacy. We've really tried to analyze and assess what are the most critical needs for Canadian communities. And this is kind of like a startup that we use to support communities with the advisory service as well. And finally, this is just an example of the communities that we're working with right now. And as you can see, it's quite a large variety. We're working with some of the biggest, but it's also some of the smallest cities across Canada. So if anybody is interested in the free program, I encourage you to email us at as@opennorth.ca. So thank you very much for your attention. And now I'd like to pass it over to our moderator, Alexandra.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria, for that lovely intro on Open North and all of its great programs. And thank you to all of us who are joining today and have dialed in from hopefully across Canada to participate in this enlightening discussion. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my esteemed panel. Joining us here today, we have three awesome participants from across Canada who are going to provide their expertise and insights on rural innovation. I will go from west to east just because I am based in the west. So we'll start off with Dan Griffin. I'd like to welcome Dan to this discussion today. He's the GIS supervisor at the District of Squamish in British Columbia. He has over 20 years of experience providing data leadership to municipal governments, and even previously worked as part of the tech team supporting the Whistler Olympic Games in 2010. Sorry to date you a little bit there, Dan. At the District of Squamish, he manages the GIS and Data Services program, where he leverages geospatial data to solve community challenges. Next, I'll be going to Jean-Marc Laflamme. So he is the Managing Director of Regen Villages Canada, where he focuses on building regenerative and resilient communities, the topic of today's discussion. He supports the management of elements including food, water, energy, and economic development across rural communities in Canada, and has over 25 years of experience as a technology professional leading digital transformation for government, rural communities, startups, and nonprofits. And last but certainly not least, going over to the eastern side of the country, I'd like to welcome Ashley Whedon. She is the editor and project coordinator for the COVID-19 Rural Insight series at the Canadian Rural Revitalization Foundation. She's a feminist and rural futurist, and we'll get into that later in this panel discussion, but her work focuses on place, power, and policy to understand how these forces intersect and impact rural communities through technological change. She's a doctoral candidate in rural studies at the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development at the University of Guelph. Welcome, Ashley, and welcome all three of you to this discussion today.
Thank you.
To kick us off, Jean-Marc, I'd like to start with you. So building on your relatively extensive expertise blending tech and rural community development, I'd like for you to take us through what tech resiliency means within a rural context.
Yeah, great question. Wow. Well, I'd like to always start with nature because that's the most important at this juncture right now. We're about to go through a state of emergency here in BC where I am. You know, one only has to look at how nature is super resilient to emulate what we need to build for our communities with technology. So for decades, technology has allowed us to connect, but we had central servers and the cloud that kept data locked up in certain organizations as keeper or monetizers of this data. When we look at the tree structure, above the ground, it seems like every tree has its own type and its own silo. But when we look underground, we see the wood wide web connected with the mycelial network, a vast microscopic web. It's kind of like an intergalactic ecosystem or an infinite number of roads leading to everywhere. And just like that, the web is evolving with tech like the blockchain and digital currencies that you've heard of as of late. So now more than ever, communities are being connected, as you know, to fiber internet or wireless internet. We need the systems that manage the data to be decentralized and not held by one or just a few organizations. We can learn open smart community standards just like Open North presents as a baseline to guide us into this resilient structure and build our own technology, which is becoming exponentially cheaper to build. So civic tech teams around Canada have demonstrated this for years. And the Regen Villages OS utilizes digital twin and machine learning software to design and operate self-reliant neighborhoods and resilient retrofits through simulation and optimization loops that improve its infrastructure. And the Village OS that we're creating is kind of like a digital mycelial network, adapt biomimetic principles of fungal intelligence in finding best patterns through nutritional flows. The goal is to inoculate intervention efficiencies at the point of sensing for the pure benefit of its inhabitants, the surrounding area of community, and improving the environment. So the software uses an overlay of strict regenerative and resilient practices, and that's as an example of what we're doing at Regen Villages.
Awesome. Thanks, Jean-Marc. I read your article on the Wood Wide Web. I thought it was really fascinating. I guess you never really consider what's going on beneath the ground.
That's right. That's from UBC professor.
Excellent. Well, just to build off your commentary there on kind of tech resiliency, broadly speaking, would you be able to give us an example of how you have used tech to help build regenerative communities anywhere in Canada?
Yeah, exactly. So in Canada, we're working on a few villages in Alberta and a few in BC and a whole pile in the EU. And I think really that's what's important at this juncture as we are going through a housing crisis and an environmental crisis, is to quickly get to the point of development. Right now, it's a lot of dealing with bureaucracy and a lot of dealing with the status quo. And so this juncture in Canada, it's a lot more feasible to kind of be developing what we call living labs, which are kind of small versions, little experimental zones that we can start to co-create with young people and older adults and people of all kinds of experiences to come together and actually see, touch, and feel these structures. And of course, they're all connected with sensors so that back home you can kind of monitor what this miniature village is doing. So in Canada, it's probably a little bit more feasible to be starting on the micro scale before we go into the macro scale with regen villages of 1,000 families. But in EU, we're able to kind of develop quite quickly because there's a lot more people, a lot more money. In Canada, we have to do things differently.
Excellent. Thanks, Jean-Marc. And Dan, maybe I'll take it over to you next. So obviously you're working on the District of Squamish's open data strategy, and I'd like for you to take us through that a bit. I'm particularly interested to understand how the strategy informs economic development in Squamish, one of the fastest growing communities in BC and likely Canada, and more so how it also supports or encourages citizen engagement.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Lexi. Yeah, I'll go back to a point that Maria mentioned in her introduction around solutions starting really, starting with solutions as opposed to identifying problems. And that was really the impetus for our open data work at the District of Squamish. It was very practical and somewhat self-serving in terms of like serving up data and alleviating pressures on our resources and staff time, just fulfilling data requests. So we had the opportunity to leverage one of our solutions and create an open data portal and fairly quickly get data up and available for people. And really the focus there was on, the development community and, engineers, architects, that professional community and the way they use data in planning and submitting applications around development. And that was a few years ago. And as that portal developed, we added more and more over time. And at the same time, we were developing our official community plan. And through that process, that's where we started to identify where our challenges were and where we wanted to focus our resources as an organization. So we developed a set of indicators through the OCP, through that official community plan process, and recognizing that a lot of these indicators are data-driven. We need to identify the data that are inputs into these indicators, and then it helps us measure those indicators over time, whether we're going away from or towards our intended goals. And a large pillar of that is also our economic development initiatives. So we got together as a team within the district, our economic development team and our data team and planning. And we put together an idea around what open data could mean for us. We did a lot of background and look at other communities. We saw a lot of larger communities within Canada and internationally that are doing amazing things with open data. But Squamish is a relatively small community with limited resources. So how do we apply the principles of open data to a small community like ours? So we decided to start with those set of principles, and we adopted a set of principles just this year. We went to our municipal council, who adopted our key principles around open government highlighting privacy and security as a core part of that, but also as a way to identify the highest value and what our strategic data should be, and how to filter out data based on those priorities, using our strategic plans and our operational plans as the filter for high value data. We wanted to ensure that we were able to not only provide strategic data, but also start to collaborate and participate with the community around data and foster that innovation. And really it's about, more hands on deck, getting people involved in solving problems within the community and helping to inform decision making around those issues that we've identified. Things like affordable housing, things like the environment and climate change. Lots of issues that have come up, and we can use data to help solve those. So we engaged with Open North. They helped us provide that strategic lens on our data, help us to identify who our stakeholders were, identify what those problem statements were, and from there that's where our policy started to evolve, and developing guidelines and resources for staff in order to identify where data is and how to make data available to the Open Data program. So we at the same time, through our economic team, we realized that we needed to really understand what our land base was to help define how we're going to get the right mix of development around residential, commercial, industrial space, green space. Where do we get the highest value? Where do we support the highest level of employment for those high wage jobs that we want to attract to the community? So we're in the process right now of developing out an employment space model based on that, and that again feeding into our open data strategy and the guidelines that we're developing.
Excellent, thank you, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of kind of refreshing the data or adding new data based on your engagement with the population, so citizens of Squamish, are there specific types of data that the community is looking for or would like to have available, if you know this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's this engagement piece is really critical, I think. We've been very much looking internally and using our strategic plans to identify what strategic data might look like within our organization and how do we help solve problems through that lens. And we're relying on those documents to help guide us in terms of informing what the community is looking for. Presumably those plans, the strategic plans, the OCP reflect the official community plan. Those documents reflect what the community's needs are. I think our next step is that more direct community engagement and actually going out to those stakeholders and engaging them in the process. As I said, we're having to find that there's a fine line there in terms of resourcing. We're again a small community, so it's how do we get the highest value for the effort that we're putting into this, and that's really that sweet spot that we're trying to get to. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to participating in those consultations when they do kick off. Excellent. And now, Ashley, over to you. I'm going to ask you a question that you spent a lot of time studying and researching on, but many of us on this call or participating in the audience might not know what place-based policy is. Can you take us through that and why it's important for rural community capacity building?
Sure. So we'll start with something that's sort of important to place. So I'm currently on the current and historical territories of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation here at the base of Lake Huron, who are also leading Canada's largest land claim to date, currently that's been going through the Supreme Court for the last couple of years to return both the land and the waters around Lake Huron that extend from that land to Indigenous stewardship. And so when we talk about place and place mattering, when we're looking at the very foundations of what reconciliation and history and truth really look like, place matters, right? Place is where our relationships develop. It's where our identities form. It's where governance does or doesn't happen. And it's where all of those sort of assets find themselves, where all of the ideas around how we came to be in a place are formed. And so I think one of the major dangers in a lot of smart cities or smart villages or whatever you want to call it, even the language itself is place attached, right? Smart cities, we don't have a language for what that looks like in a rural context other than just sort of slap rural on it and therefore it's the same thing. And that's problematic because we know that what happens in Barcelona versus what happens in Amsterdam versus what happens in Toronto or Vancouver is going to be different because those are different cities. So we wouldn't expect to wholesale import the same policies that are happening there to those other cities. We do this a lot in Canada. We import often failed European policies to North America and then wonder why they don't work. And we are at risk of doing that in rural contexts now as well, where we say if it works in Toronto, then it should work in Pickle Lake or Birds Cove or Nelson or Squamish, you know, and this continuum around what these places look like, feel like, and what their own aspirations and goals are get lost in terms of what this is prescribed over top of it. And a really good example around taking a view around why we need to pay attention to this is when we were all kind of paying attention to the drama happening out of, you know, Trump Tower and the White House. Google was betting on being able to take over large chunks of public infrastructure in the city of Toronto and elsewhere. So we have this tension around, while we're distracted sometimes from thinking what the right thing to do is, we get this idea around ever optimizing things. So if you think of your own ideas around how you look about how you optimize place and your experience in place, when you get up from your desk and you've got to go to the washroom, you often will pick up a cup and you'll take that with you, and then you'll do 6 other things on your way to the washroom, instead of just saying, sometimes maybe I just need to go to the bathroom, and that's fine. And so we need to be careful about what we're looking to optimize and whether that's high value in the place in which that's happening. And to that end, I'd really point folks to read, there's a new book out by Shannon Mattern, who's just a fabulous writer and thinker on all things are related to urban infrastructure. And she's got this great book that says, The City is Not a Computer. And I think when we start talking about living labs, when we start talking about all of these processes, we have to be really, really careful to consider people and place and how that happens in place, because we're not machines. We don't want to be machines. So in terms of the strategies that we're developing, being sensitive to not only the economy in a given region, but how that's shaped by natural resources, history, relationships. And that's even more particular in rural areas because you have greater distance to density and lower density. So the number of people and the influence of that place has a bigger role to play. And so when we start looking into what place-based policy means, is how do we respond to and reflect and address all of the aspects that go into making a place somewhere in particular, and respect and respond to that rather than trying to shoehorn it into something else. And this is really about also incorporating different ideas of place. So the best way to understand this is to think of, you're on a train and you're cutting across the landscape, but that's not just a linear journey. You're not just kind of cutting across the landscape forever. You're passing through places where other people are inhabiting, and you might get to a train station and see someone waiting for a loved one or waiting to get on the train or looking harried, ready to go to work. And in your mind, that person is stuck there forever, right? You're always going to think of that train station as that person being there. In reality, they went off to live their entire life or to do something different or travel somewhere else. And so places have layered meanings. And so we need to sort of tease out all of these different aspects to be responsive to those and devolve as much power as we can to local communities.
Excellent answers. Maybe to follow up on that, so you kind of mentioned about not really shoehorning existing policies to fit these communities, but looking at the specific nature of them and creating unique ones. I'll ask you maybe a bit of a cheeky question, but in this case, what's your thoughts on the current broad Canadian innovation agenda? Does it miss the mark for rural communities?
Entirely. So when we look at the, not to put too fine a point on it there, I saw Dan laugh because, the thing is we can start from the origins of the current Canadian innovation agenda in its current conception. So when that was happening and starting to coalesce in 2015, 2016, every single consultation with Canadians and Canadian communities took place in an urban environment. We looked at Edmonton, Calgary, Montreal, Vancouver. I believe Halifax might have been included, but I'm not entirely sure. We might have missed an entire chunk of the country. And so what that says from the get-go is that rural Canada doesn't belong in the current federal approach to innovation and what that looks like at the policy level. And if you want to belong, then you have to find a way to shoehorn your way into what's happening right now, because your voices aren't being heard in the formation of how that's going to go about and the development of the policy and program responses. And we can see that in action, right? So we developed a Smart Cities Challenge that had kind of a rural, remote, and Indigenous kind of component to it, but was all kind of grouped together, which is a thing we do in Canadian rural policy. We put rural, remote, and First Nations together as if they're all one word. And we know that there's a tremendous diversity amongst rural, let alone between rural and remote, within remote, and definitely among First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And so why do we group them all together? And that's because the centers of political and economic decision-making are still Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa. And without having people that are actually in community making decisions and informing the policy that shapes what happens in that community, we end up with these big knowledge gaps around what is the actual reality on the ground. So we're seeing this happen through really terrible broadband policy in terms of how we build infrastructure in this country, what kinds of innovation gets supported, how we even talk about innovation to begin with. So things related to the Barton Report, right? Our largest piece of advice to the current sitting prime minister that's based on some largely debunked research by Richard Florida around creative economies and the creative class, which stuff that he himself has come out to say was pretty shoddy work. That informs our current strategy on innovating in agri-food, and that's the only thing that we have really touching rural innovation in this country from a national policy agenda perspective. So when we start to stack these on top of each other, and then we layer this idea around maybe importing some of the smart specialization strategies from Europe, what we're really doing to rural communities is just creating new company towns and saying, well, instead of being manufacturing or natural resource extraction, you should be tourism-based and innovate around that, or you should be this industry-based and innovate around that, which recreates the same vulnerabilities. To fix this, what we really need to do is bring back things like, we had the Rural Secretariat at one point. It was shuttered in 2013. However, it never really had any teeth to begin with. It was sort of an optional process that policy could go through to verify that it had a rural lens to it. There's been a lot of discussion of the development of a rural lens at the federal level, but we're just still waiting to see what that actually looks like and how it's applied. But those things need to have consequences, teeth, and action to them, and to use what a lot of folks use in the United Kingdom and elsewhere around rural proofing, which is really, how do we make sure that this policy matters in rural communities, that it works in a rural context, and that it comes from those places. So how do we develop that better? And in a large degree, we really need to look at how we devolve more of those powers and responsibilities to local communities and regional bodies.
Excellent. No, love the answer. I mean, it is kind of absolutely about getting the right people at the table, getting rural communities involved in the discussions, not setting policy for them. And on that topic, I'll shift it over to you, Dan, again, especially as we're seeing much more migration towards rural communities. I think during COVID, we've seen a relatively large pattern of migration from cities to more suburban or rural areas, Squamish being one of them. And I have to say I'm part of the problem as I moved here last year. But I love the town, and definitely from the recent stats, I believe from March 2020 to 2021, we've seen about a 200% increase in home sales, despite rapidly increasing costs. More development in the downtown core and around Squamish. And I think what often happens in situations like this is that infrastructure is struggling to catch up. So from your perspective at the District of Squamish, what do you see as the immediate infrastructure priorities to cope with this large influx of people to the town? And how does it take into consideration the specific aspects or regional qualities of Squamish?
Yeah, I think building on what Ashley said, I thought her point around engaging with the local community around growth and understanding the needs of the community and not be prescriptive around that is really a key. We've seen a huge transition in Squamish, coming really an industrial logging town to now more of a recreation-based, technology-centered kind of community. really shifting that demographic within Squamish. And there's been a lot of pressures that come along with that, and a lot of adaptations that need to happen in order to adjust and adapt the way that we do business as a community in terms of local government, and how we engage with people who are coming into the town and making sure they understand the nuances and the dynamics that are happening here. I think the ways that we're using technology in order to engage with people, in a very direct way, around things like wildlife management, identifying who the new people are when they come to town, so that we can go out and knock on their door and provide them with information around, bearware and being, locking up their garbage, making sure that they're being respectful of the environment, and technology plays a key part in that, because we're able to target those areas, target those people where we want to focus our efforts and energies. In the same way, through visitor management, people coming to town, they're to visit or recreate here. We want to make sure that they're aware, and that they're not, doing things outside or creating safety issues for the community. Wildfires, litter, all kinds of visitor management issues that come up. And how do we address those? How do we target our efforts and focus our energies, again, because we're a small community. We don't have a huge bylaw staff to help support that. So we want to be targeted with our efforts. So I think there's lots of opportunity where technology can help support that, and not necessarily drive the solution, but actually help solve the problem. Squamish, in terms of our own infrastructure, there's been a lot of planning and forecasting around infrastructure, how to adapt to growth, how we're going to manage growth. We're quite lucky in some respects. We've got a great aquifer. We have access to water. We have the infrastructure set up in order to serve the community. But we also don't want to be in a place where we have to be reactive. Recently we saw the heat dome, in Western Canada. Unprecedented temperatures here. Our water demand went from an average of 16 million liters a day in Squamish on a summer day to 19 million liters a day. So, a significant increase, put a lot of stress on our infrastructure. We might have the water in order to supply that, but the infrastructure itself is under pressure when we have that kind of demand. So we want to be able, we want to be forward thinking in terms of how we build out the infrastructure, but we also want to do it in the most, resource friendly and economic way. So we're encouraging infill, centering people in population centers, not having distributed infrastructure that requires a lot more resources in order to maintain that. Keeping a growth management boundary, not letting sprawl happen. All these things can help support our infrastructure that we do have, and make sure that we're keeping our costs in line, down the road. And that goes hand in hand with preserving our natural environment and the green space. Obviously, recreation is a huge part of that in Squamish, so preserving our recreation, looking at recreation as part of our infrastructure as well. Those, the mountain bike trails and hiking trails, the climbing opportunities where people come here to recreate. So keeping all that in mind and ensuring that we're putting the master plans in place in order to support the infrastructure in the long term.
Excellent. I love the blend of kind of managing that growth, but maintaining environmental boundaries, if you will. For example, where my townhouse is located, we're not too far from the estuary, so fingers crossed they don't continue to build too much in that area. Okay. And Jean-Marc, now I'll take it over to you to discuss a different topic related to migration. So some might move from the cities just looking for more space, just more quiet, for example, but others are quite literally forced sometimes out of where they live. You did mention the state of emergency that we have in BC currently due to the wildfires, and I think there's over 100 evacuation orders in the province. So from your perspective, how do you think climate migration is going to impact rural communities in Canada? And is there a way that technology can play a role to help mitigate some of these potentially harmful impacts?
Yeah, great question. Super loaded. And, I'll bring this back to the key points that Ashley and Dan stated around civic engagement. This is a time where we have to come together with really unique activities, which we've been doing for a very long time. But we need to get way more creative by, again, including youth and older adults and professionals, both near and far, to kind of hyperanalyze these solutions on a local level. And then if you kind of zoom out, there's some tremendous things happening in Canada. Even the innovation centers have come together under the Canadian Accelerator and Incubator Network, and they're really thinking methodically around how innovation is happening at a rapid speed for particular challenges on a hyper-local level. And that group is doing some tremendous work to kind of bring this country together to really understand the unique innovation for a particular location or a place, as Ashley so well described. But if it can go a little bit forward into the future and kind of reimagine what we could be having, there are many ways that tech can manage mass migration. It really comes down to the case studies and some of these experiments and how widely they can spread to build open, smart communities connected to each other with these innovation centers. So these communities are no longer forever, just like companies are no longer forever, as our current generations have experienced in the past. But, far back in the past, we've gone boom or bust. Now the new economy allows a professional to grab land, which is happening all over Canada, big land grab, in quiet rural communities without the need for local human collaboration or natural resources to make income. Now that we're moving to decentralization, anyone can pop up a community just like camping. Imagine a world where we're physically moving as much of the data on the internet or the mycelium network. Imagine if we're actually physically moving that way too. If we thought the golden age of travel with airlines and fossil fuel vehicles was powerful, imagine a world serviced with electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. The Canadian Advanced Air Mobility Consortium out of Vancouver is going to prove this summer with an eVTOL. So going deep into your backyard, just like a car does now, is a lot easier with these electric flying vehicles, moving around a little bit faster. Now fully connected and perpetually off-grid, fueled with solar, wind, and other renewables. So indeed, mass climate migration has begun, and naturally humans will adapt with technology solutions to make sure we find ways to survive. BC seemed like a great province to live in, but this fire season, like a few others before it, may force us into radical new solutions with fire prevention. Imagine, drone firefighting, which is being innovated across this province and across the country, where swarms of drone or robots daisy chain together to carry fire retardant. Or we build large pop-up fire breaks made with new fire-resistant nanomaterial. Otherwise, we're heading north or east or on the ocean like pirates, somewhere to thrive without the anxiety we carry today. In our plans, we must bring on real affordable living with radical, inexpensive prefab housing, vertical food, and shared transportation, so humans can focus full time on these grand challenges, just like the climate emergency or AI, instead of working for companies just making stuff that we don't need to survive. So we have a lot of land in Canada, and we can make this happen for millions, if not billions of people.
Awesome. Thanks, Jean-Marc. And last question that I have before we get to some audience questions goes to you, Ashley. And you have kind of discussed this in your previous commentary, but you have dubbed yourself or have been dubbed a rural futurist. I love the term, haven't heard it before. But if you can kind of take us through what that really means, and ultimately what you think the must-have foundations for sustainable rural innovation are in Canada.
Right. So the rural futurist kind of moniker came largely out of being incredibly irritated that urbanists thought they were the only ones with a claim to what the future looked like. So we had particularly 5 to 10 years ago, and it's just escalated ever since, folks that are in urban environments talking about, the age of cities, that this is the only way forward, that rural places are really only where food production, energy production, or climate guilt gets assuaged through, carbon sinks and those kinds of things. And a real major kind of contrary spirit to that being that, living in, as an Ontario kid, moving to Toronto never appealed to me. Nothing about that was part of anything that was the life that I wanted for myself or what I had known. However, all of the discourse around me in both policy and working in government for quite a long time before I came back to academic circles was that cities really were where it was at. And so this is where my whole argument around place becomes, but then also around rural development in general. So we need to find ways to unhook rural development from urbanization or from other processes. And to do that, we really need to consider 3 questions. And in some regards, this directly challenges some of the stuff you just said, Jean-Marc, because I did disagree with some chunks of that, which are that, we need to look at rural places. Do we value them in and of themselves without taking something from them, without making them a sink for our carbon guilt, without making them a place that people escape to? Because all of that represents is disaster gentrification, right? It's not just big corporate interests that are doing kind of a land grab. In and of ourselves, if we're moving to rural areas to escape the fear of COVID in urban environments, which we learned had nothing to do with density and everything to do with inequality, if we're moving to get away from, kind of the rapidly eroding shoreline or from fires, who are we displacing? And who gets to do that? Who are the people that are doing that? It tends to be the people that you described, Jean-Marc, which are white collar workers who then also still want to be able to go out to dinner, be served coffee, to be able to fill up their gas, to be able to buy firewood, to do all that kind of stuff. Who are they displacing? And can those people still afford to live in the places that they've called home for generations? The other bit around that is that these places have been home since time immemorial. All you have to do is look at a map of, place names from Indigenous peoples spanning thousands of years. They're not empty spaces. They've been people's homes. And so we have to balance that, however, with the idea that we do need people to be in rural areas. We do need to attract people to these communities. However, we do run into big challenges with this, and we've seen this happen a lot in Atlantic Canada, certainly in BC as well, where a lot of urban folks with particularly urbanized notions of what community engagement looks like, what services should be available, what that quality and fabric of a community looks like, come in and start running the show at those council meetings or start telling people how they should be. And all that does is alienate rural people, right? I was at the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals with Jeffrey Sachs, and he's standing up there at the University of Waterloo and talking about how we should be putting, hydro dams here and turbines here because nobody lives there. And he put his hand over a spot on the map where 20,000 people live. So all that does is alienate the people that need to be on your side if you're talking about climate agenda and moving that forward. The second part of this is there a right to be rural? And what does that look like if we start looking at this through a rights-based lens? If we're looking at this in terms of broadband access, for example, why is 50/10 acceptable in rural communities as a target when we get gig or higher in most of our cities in Canada? Is lesser infrastructure and lesser rights okay just because you live in a rural or remote community? And so if we start looking at those things through a rights-based lens, it changes the conversation entirely and also brings us to that question of who gets to decide what happens next. And so from that perspective, we really do need to return to the first principles of good public policy design. Good tech policy, good digital policy, good futurism is just good policy design, which is what problem are we trying to solve and who ultimately is any better off by the virtue of what we're doing. So we need to know what the goal is, what we're trying to accomplish, who needs to be on side, and then we need to look at it and say, so what? If we do this, so what? Because you can do this, for example, in climate. So if we measure the parts per million of phosphorus in Lake Huron, that's great, but do we know what the threshold is there? Do we know, if it amounts to a thimbleful, is that too much? Or what is the tolerance there? Or is the goal total eradication? But we need to know what the spillover of that is and to be able to make informed compromises. There are no perfect choices, but we need rural leaders to be able to look at these things with their eyes wide open and make a choice that reflects what they want to happen in their community. This also reflects kind of the life cycle of places. Is the goal to keep every rural community alive forever and ever? Amen. If that's the goal, that's fine. However, that comes at the expense of other things. And amalgamation is a scary thing to a lot of people. Here in Ontario, particularly in rural contexts, the 2000 era amalgamation lives in an active part of everyone's brain if you work in local government. It's still part of the fabric of how we do decision making. It's still at the top of the table. So we really need to kind of look at this, and I'm going to pull a quote to just wrap it up from Shannon Mattern's just recent book, because I love it. I can't recommend it high enough. The City is Not a Computer, is that our current kind of paradigm, to whether it's smart cities, smart communities, smart villages, whatever you want to use, it appeals to us because it takes what Shannon says, it takes the messiness of life, messiness of living in a society, and turns it into something programmable and subject to rational order. And we all know that people are not logical or rational. People are weird. We do strange stuff, and we do a lot of stuff in order to preserve the things that are comfortable or meaningful to us, even if they're maladaptive to the realities in which we find ourselves now. And the real goal of sustainable rural innovation, and I think sustainable and innovation are kind of, it's like baby grand and tiger shrimp and all that kind of stuff. Like, I think we need to unhook those terms as well, is really getting clear around this idea of how do we take that away and deal with the messiness of the reality of life, and look at that and build that bridge from the messiness of today to the messiness to where we want to go in terms of what that's going to look for that is allowable and adaptable to all of those kinds of relationships and change.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. And love the comment about there being no perfect solution. Ultimately, it is about getting everybody around the table, making sure voices are heard, but acknowledging that there are going to be bumps along the road and nothing is going to be perfect. We have about 5 minutes left, so I think we have time for at least one question. I'll take a stab at this first one by Jamie, and this question is: if we take place-based economic development to its logical outcomes, developing many responsibilities to local communities, how do you see the role of provinces and federal government changing? And I'll open that to anybody that wants to take a shot at that question.
I'll take a quick stab and then I'll be quiet, I promise. But is that place-based doesn't mean abandoning rural communities and just saying you're on your own and therefore there's no role for a larger regional or federal approach. What it does mean is that those approaches are fed into a responsive network back and forth. So we want to look at this less as a vertical relationship and more around kind of hubs and nodes. And the important part around looking at this policy in terms of its natural, devolution, as it were, what we really want to talk about is the appropriateness of scale. So it doesn't make sense. I think, networks like EORN in Ontario, the Eastern Ontario Regional Network, or CASLO, which I know where you're located, Jean-Marc, or the work done in Hamiota, those are all great examples of communities succeeding in building infrastructure despite policy. And those shouldn't be held up as good things as everybody should be doing it. Instead, we should be saying, look at the ingenuity of communities that have had to go it alone. Wouldn't it be better if they didn't have to, and we could feed this into an actually holistically planned national broadband piece of infrastructure? Because that makes sense, right? To do that at the provincial and national scale. So a place-based approach is really about finding the things that it does make sense to say, we've got community buy-in, this is the stuff we want. How do we feed that into something that does make sense on a provincial or national scale? And what are the things that do make sense to deal with more locally? And so they need to be in conversation with each other rather than just a total, moving to the city-state kind of thing, which will create all kinds of other externalities and problems. So that's sort of our perspective on that, coming from a broadband piece. And stay tuned, there's some work coming from myself and Wayne Kelly that's talking a bit more about that in the next week or so.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of back that up as well with the tangible work that's happening in rural communities with again, civic engagement activities, and then most importantly, civic engagement platforms. We just spent 10 years hooked on US technology to communicate. Simple. And now we get to build, co-design and build our own civic engagement platforms. And for the past 10 years, there have been some really great platforms out there to start to understand more about what the community would like to take on, the solutions they have, and prioritize those solutions in order. And so I think right now, everybody's trying to clamor at these different engagement methods. And we do have the technology out there to kind of start to experiment with.
Excellent. Thank you. And we have 2 more minutes left, so maybe I'll squeeze in one last question. And this question is, what can urban areas learn from rural innovation? Anyone want to take a shot at that?
I think we should hear from Dan because they're doing all kinds of stuff in Squamish.
Squamish.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's yeah, what can rural areas learn? I mean, what can urban areas learn from rural? What I think, you know, back to a point that was made earlier in terms of migration and adaptation. You know, we are certainly seeing that influx from the urban areas into rural areas, and I think, you know, the things that attract people here are the things that exist in many places, including the urban built environment. You know, there's nature there, there's environment there, there's community there. You know, protecting and preserving our natural environment, you know, is I think paramount. And obviously, you know, with the amount of biodiversity loss and you know, the pressures that are happening around the natural environment, I think, you know, from a rural perspective, if we call Squamish that, you know, that's an asset, that's a resource that we have and we need to protect and maintain. Alexandria mentioned the Squamish Estuary, an amazing place, a huge carbon sink, has tons of biodiversity there. You know, identifying that as a value asset for the community, you know, I think urban areas could do a lot more to do that and preserve their natural spaces.
Excellent answer. And we're unfortunately at the end of our time today, so we will have to wrap it up. If there are any other audience questions, happy to forward those along to the panelists and get those answered for you guys. But just want to thank everyone for attending today's discussion. It was awesome. I think we could have talked for another hour if we had the time. Really appreciate all the panelists' participation, and to everybody that tuned in, thank you, and stay tuned for more discussions of this nature.
Thank you.